A world I could not imagine. As the sun rose over the cane fields each morning, we would stop cutting stalks and sit below the wooden shed drinking rum and smoking cigarettes. His battery-operated radio never moved from the BBC World Service, and it would fill the gaps of silence in our conversations. The British accents would beam the dramatic events of the 1970s to our ears in the little farming town of Princestown in southern Trinidad. For every country the BBC broadcaster gave news about, Uncle Sundar had a story, almost like he had visited them all. When Nixon resigned as American president, Uncle Sundar celebrated, telling me it was a victory for Indian people everywhere. I was confused about the link, but I didn't question him. He cried at the news of Elvis Presley's death, claiming he had met him when the American singer came to perform in Trinidad many years before. The BBC World Service paid tribute to Elvis Presley's life by playing his most popular songs for an hour. But Uncle Sundar talked over the entire marathon. Then, when the two popes died back-to-back in 1978, he said God was punishing the Catholic Church. He had never been anywhere outside of this small town, but the BBC broadcast brought the world to him. It did the same for me on his little black radio.
Joining us this morning in studio is none other than Ryan Bachoo. You know his name, you know his voice, but this morning he joins us in a different capacity as author. Good morning, Ryan, and welcome.
Good morning, Natasha. Thank you so much for having me on.
It's a pleasure to have you with us on the show this morning, and firstly, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
We just got a little sneak peek of An Unending Search, a brand new book, and I know that there's definitely a lot of emotion tied to it, a lot of your feelings as well, and I'm thinking perhaps maybe a little bit of your journey has been married to it.
I think so. That's a pretty accurate statement. I think growing up in South Trinidad and seeing the content of South Trinidad did have a lot of influence on this book. But yes, you're right in the sense that it does sort of marry the experiences of the country that I've grown up in, which is Trinidad and Tobago, into West Indian fiction, and a will to really put West Indian fiction back on the bookshelves of not just bookstores, but also schools.
So let's talk about that, the will to put West Indian fiction basically back on the map, for want of a better expression. What drove you to this place?
So my love for West Indian fiction is my favorite genre of books. I grew up reading Naipaul, Anthony Selvon, Derek Walcott, and reading them, you know, I thought to myself, you know, I wanted to write what I saw in the same way that Michael Anthony wrote what he saw in The Year in San Fernando, and V.S. Naipaul wrote what he saw in Miguel Street. I thought there was a lot of content where I came from that was similar to that. And so I took a stab at it in 2009, not really thinking that a physical book would ever be printed, but it took me 5 years to write the first draft. I didn't think the first draft was very good by the time I was finished in 2014. So I put it down. I also didn't have any money to publish the book. I picked it back up in 2023, and it was like writing a whole new book because my writing had changed so much. And then within a year, the editor said, you know, this is something that you should print.
And here we are today.
Here we are today.
No, it's quite interesting. You said 2009, you put it down, you picked it back up in 2023. But of course, we also know that you are within the media space, which is a lot to navigate as well. So where did you find the time to balance all of that?
That's a loaded question. When I got home at night, I would write until 1 a.m., sometimes 2 a.m. I'm not gonna, you know, I love writing, but it was difficult. It felt like a task. It felt like a job, a second job. It felt difficult at times. Sometimes I was very tired, frustrated after work. Sometimes the words won't come, but I kept punching away at the keyboard, just trying to get to the finish line with this novel.
Yeah, and did you eventually get some sleep?
I eventually got some sleep.
All right, let's talk a little bit particularly about An Unending Search. We see a lot of narratives of justice, of classism, of racism, and much more coming out of it. How were you able to sort of, I would say, go back in time in many ways and put this onto paper and bring it to life? Did you take from current experiences as well, or was it all from fiction?
Both current experiences as well as fiction. And you could say that there's a lot of fiction in there, but I also try to make it as realistic as possible by talking to a lot of the elder folks who were around in the late 60s, early 70s, during that Black Power movement era of Trinidad and Tobago history, to get a sense of what it was like, to make sure that the street names that I used existed back then, to paint a vivid but accurate picture, although it is fiction, to paint an accurate or an as accurate a picture as possible of what 1970s Trinidad would have been like. Not just in terms of infrastructure, not just in terms of the geography of the place, but also in terms of life there, how people lived, the accent in which they spoke and how they spoke, the mentality of people back then during the Williams government. So yeah, it did, I have a lot of people to thank in terms of who would have been able to paint that picture at a time when I didn't exist.
Of course, but it's quite interesting because the way that it's written, I mean, for me, myself, it took me back to a time even as childhood driving through what would have been the cane fields then to now. And it brings this sense of identity. So it's so wonderful that you've been able to just bring this out from a brief synopsis of the book. So one can only imagine what's in store. Now, I know, of course, you can't give it away, but can you tell us a little bit about the protagonist?
Yeah, so the protagonist is called Ta. That's his nickname. And he's named Ta because, again, in keeping with this Trinidad and Tobago characteristics of these villages that we all grew up in. He's called Ta because he's a black Indian teenage boy. His friends make fun of him because he's so black, so they call him Ta. And he works in the cane fields with Uncle Sundar, who's a village elder. And Uncle Sundar, being the elder that he is, he sort of has racism and anti-blackness instilled in him almost from his own parents. And he encourages Ta. He tells Ta, listen, the Williams government is racist. There's a lot of division. There's not a lot for Indian people in this country. You should try to go to London or New York, where you'll find a better quality of life, where you'll find more jobs. And so the novel takes the reader on a journey of Ta trying to find his way out of Trinidad. And in that journey, he encounters speed bumps of racism, of classism, of division. He comes to Port of Spain to live at some point in the book, and he realizes that it's a vastly different life from Princestown. He goes to New York for a trip and realizes that racism exists there as well in a much grander way. And so the reality of what Uncle Sundar has been telling him all along, he realizes that this is just an old man with an old way of thinking, and the view, the outlook of the world really isn't what Uncle Sundar is actually painting for him.
I think it's something that so many people really can identify with as well.
Yes,
to speak about that, and we see the cycles of what has happened in Trinidad and Tobago over the years.
Cycles is such a critical word.
It is,
yeah.
And this is, I think that's perhaps one of the beauties of this, because even we were discussing off air, for me this is very reminiscent of literature I would have done in secondary school, and literature our parents would have asked us, and maybe not asked, but made us read to learn a bit more. But now as you're older, well, at least for me, I definitely grew a love for it. Now let's speak a little bit about your launch. I know it's upcoming tomorrow.
Yeah, so I will officially launch the book tomorrow, although it is available for pre-order already and available at Nigel Arcan's bookstores. But yes, I will officially launch the book tomorrow to what is really a milestone moment in my own career, as you would have mentioned a little bit earlier, being a journalist for such a long time, but now actually, being an author.
It's interesting because one would think, at least from where we sit, the fact that you work in media as a journalist, you already have such a way with words, and we've seen that from the accolades that you've been able to receive over the years and accomplish as well. So congratulations on that. But this is definitely stepping into a different space. You said you loved writing, you've been doing it for so long, but how does it actually feel to you, just as Ryan, not as anything else, but as Ryan?
It feels, it feels as though this is initially what I wanted for myself, even before I was a journalist. And to be honest with you, Natasha, I started this book even before I became a journalist. I became a journalist in 2010. This book started in 2009. And it feels like this is, this is sort of connecting my childhood with my adult life, because I spent much of my childhood reading West Indian fiction, and now to be able to write West Indian fiction, it just feels like I've connected my childhood with what I want to do as an adult.
Absolutely beautiful. Before we wrap, any closing comments for Trinidad and Tobago?
I just want to say thank you for the outpouring of support from yourself, from a lot of our colleagues as well in the media, to a lot of Trinbagonians who would have reached out to me over the last few days when I made the announcement that this book was going to be published. It's not an easy thing to put yourself out there. I don't even know, Natasha, if this book will stand up to scrutiny. But whether it does or it doesn't, the outpouring of support that I've received and positive feedback, I have absolutely been overwhelmed and really heartwarmed by it.
Absolutely beautiful, and well, congratulations again from all of us here. And for those of you who are watching, it's time for you to go and get a brand new book, An Unending Search, the first book by Ryan Bachoo. Thanks again for joining us. This is Now Morning Show. Stay tuned. They'll be back in a few moments.